In today's video, I'm going to be continuing on the series talking about extended essay writing. Here I'm going to be talking about 33 markers. These are for the OCR A-Level Geography spec, but these approaches can be applied to lots of essay writing. In the last video, I talked about that these long extended essays are a balance of AO1, which is knowledge, and applying knowledge, AO2. Here it's the same, but we just have a heavier weighting for AO2. So it's 24 marks and 9 marks for knowledge. So the technique doesn't really change that much. It's largely about the quality and the depth of the analysis that will get you those higher marks. Again, I'm going to be talking about PESTs to help us apply that knowledge, the AO2. I've talked about this in the previous video, and if you want to pause the video just to make sure you're clear on what the actual acronym PEST actually means, I pause it now. So I've decided to do this again for a question. The question is for the disease dilemma specification, and the question is that strategies that deal with disease risk and eradication at a local scale are more effective than at any other scale. To what extent do you agree? If you want to pause the video and have a go at answering the questions, I'll give yourself 45 minutes to answer this and have a go at seeing how you would answer it without the tutorial, and then I'm going to walk through step by step what you would actually want to do. I'm going to give you other opportunities in the video to stop and have a go at each section if you'd like. So this question, again, it starts with a really brief introduction. We don't want to overcomplicate it. Be very brief. Make sure you've got a definition and a one line to bridge into the argument, and no more than 3 or 4 lines in total. Here again, I've defined it literally in the first sentence. I've said what disease eradication is, and then my second and third line simply say that there are other types of strategies you can use, including national and global strategies. And then I leave a line to say that the most effective strategy is global. You don't have to do that, but sometimes in these big essays, it can just say, this is where I'm going with my argument. If you did the first bit where you did a definition and saying the kind of other areas that you could explore, that would be good enough. So when looking at this question, the first thing that I'd be expecting to do is to be able to actually tackle this idea of the local scale. When I'm making my first argument, I start with the words that are given to you in the question. I make a point, but it has to be clear but complex. What do I mean by that? Well, in my actual point you can read here, I've said that a successful strategy is local strategies. And the reason why is because of local expertise and knowledge. So the reason why it's a complex point is because it hasn't just said that a successful strategy can be local. It's said slightly why, but very briefly. And it's focused on this idea of local expertise and knowledge that can help eradicate a disease. So again, with my point, only 1 or 2 lines. I don't want to put my entire argument in my point. My argument, first of all, comes in my explanation. This is where I am doing the because. This is where I am explaining what I'm actually trying to say in that initial point. What I've tried to get us to focus on here is place-specific detail that's woven in rather than separate, and signposting the argument with good connecting words. What do I mean by a good connecting word? Well, I'll highlight one here. Just say using the word for example. That is just a really simple way to say to the examiner, I'm going in this direction. Here I've talked about Ghana and guinea worm. I've said that the cases were 180,000 in 1989. They educated women who were able to identify water sources because they were the gatekeepers to water. They actually looked after the water sources. And I've even put a line in to say that they were more effective than men who they tried to do this with, but it didn't work. Again, I've only written somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 sentences because I'm realised that I'm only getting 9 marks for this section for AO1. It's still detailed. It still says what actually happens in terms of a local strategy and how it eradicates disease. But where I'm going to get a lot of my marks is in the next section, which is the where I'm applying the PEST technique, and this is the AO2 applying knowledge. So I've put the question here again so we don't lose track of it. And I've highlighted this bit here which says, to what extent do you agree? So the reason why I've come up with the PEST technique is it's the complexity of the argument. We've already stated that local strategies are important. We've said how they've got rid of a disease in Ghana. But then I'm saying, either in this bit of the argument, I'm going, yeah, but, so that's complex because it's not quite as simple as that. Or I'm really doubling down to say, this is actually super significant because of this reason. So in the example I talked about pests, I could have either chosen scale, spatial, time, significance, success, which I've highlighted as my first bullet point here. What I've decided to go with is the most appropriate of those. I'm not trying to apply all of them. I'm only trying to apply one of them. So I'm putting a cross through. I'm not trying to necessarily talk about all of these, just the most appropriate. Here I've talked about spatial differences. I've said that in the north of Ghana it was slower because there was a war there and therefore they couldn't get to people to train them. But I've also talked about scale a little bit. I've said that while most of the people that were doing these local strategies were NGOs, and because of that they did not have the same resources as global strategies to actually eradicate disease. So here, rather than doing this is significant, I've done the yeah, but. So I've said that they are effective local strategies, but I've said, however, there are some spatial issues, and also the scale of what they can do isn't very big beyond a national scale. Here, again, I've written somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 lines. And I've done a nice link back to the question here where I've said local strategies are effective on a national scale, but actually the global strategies are the most effective to eradicate disease. So this argument here is where I'm going to double down later on, but I've already set it up in my link back to the question. So at the moment, all I've written is a really clear point, an explanation of 3 to 5 lines, and then I've done the yeah, but. This is the where I've used the pests. So in total, I've probably written in the context of my entire argument somewhere between 10 to 15 lines on just this first argument. So this is where I want you to stop the video and think about how you would come up with a second argument. I've given you indications of where you could go, global strategies. Then could you do something about national governments and how they can effectively eradicate disease risk? And then there needs to be a conclusion. So if you want to have a go at writing the rest of the argument for your essay from this point forward, those are the steps I would take. And then I'm going to walk through what you actually have to do to get onto the to the next bit of the argument. So now I'm going to talk about the second argument. You might have had a go at this, you might not have. I'm going to talk about global strategies. I'm going to be using the same technique as I was earlier on, where I talked about making a complex point and then making explanation after that, which is 3 to 5 lines. My complex point here is to say that I think that global strategies is the most effective, and I've said because they have the resources to be able to coordinate a coherent and effective response globally. I've then gone on to explain this. The evidence I've given here is to talk about the smallpox eradication initiative. I've talked about how the UN did that and also how they implemented a strategy to eradicate polio and through the Polio Eradication Fund. And I've talked about how that went from 125 countries to just 2. So here I have talked quite clearly about how they've actually effectively got rid of 2 major diseases. Well, smallpox in entirety eradicated, and polio to a large extent down to just 2 countries. Here again, 7 lines opening up my argument. I'm not focusing too much on the explanation because I know I'm going to make AO2 marks up. In the second bit of my argument, same strategies I've used before. I'm thinking about which bit of pests I'm going to use, and here I've used spatial differences. So I've said polio was eradicated in lots of places, but however, places like Pakistan and Afghanistan it hasn't been. This is because of porous borders. This is because of social issues and religious issues, including vaccinations being haram. And therefore, they actually need national cooperation with the global strategy to be entirely effective. Here, again, in my link out of the question, and link out of my AO2, I've really doubled down on that. I've said because they can coordinate responses and have the resources to have sustained global impact, they can generally do a very, very good job. Even though I've said, yeah, but I've refocused my answer to say that even though there are some difficulties in a couple of countries, overall, because they can coordinate such a big response, because they have a sustained global impact, they are the most effective. So again, I've added a complexity into my argument, and in my link, I have really reiterated why I think it's the most effective strategy. Again, for my third argument, I've put the entire argument in one section here just to show you how all this fits together. I've gone for a complex point where I've said that national strategies are effective, and especially when they work with UN. I've then given the example of Mauritius and talked about how they got rid of malaria. But then I have talked about how national strategies sometimes lack consistency. There can be issues within countries that therefore lead to them not being eradicated. In the example of Mauritius, they had a cyclone that brought back the disease. In the example of Ethiopia here, the drugs became the malaria parasite became resistant to the chloroquine drug, and they also relied on external money. So then in my link out of the question, and I put it again in red because it should be very, very similar to my point. I've said that despite being successful nationally, national strategies are not the most effective way, as they lack coherency, and they can't really have an impact beyond the global, rather than a global strategy. So that would be my three arguments that I would make if I were writing this essay. Some people would say, do you need to make more than that? I think it's about consistency of application here. Make sure you have a clear point, make sure you have a good explanation, but spend a lot of time really hammering home that AO2, that PEST technique. In your conclusion, all you should be doing therefore to finish it off is 3 or 5 sentences that summarize your argument in its complexity. If you read this conclusion in a second, pause the video to read it. It doesn't say anything new, so I'm not going to read it out. But just see that I have just picked out what I think are the kind of one-line headliners from my main argument and put it here. I've still concluded that global strategies are the most effective, but I've said local strategies and national strategies have some success. That would be my essay. This essay, when you type it out, is over 1,000 words, roughly 4 to 5 pages of written. This can be done in 45 minutes. Extra timers would obviously have longer than that, but this can be done in exam conditions. I would say that the fundamentals are following this technique and trying to apply it and having enough time to have a good introduction, a good conclusion, rather than trying to get 4 or 5 arguments in there, case study, dump lots of information, and don't have an absolute structure to your argument. I hope this is helpful. Please put any notes that you'd like in the kind of comments, and good luck in improving your essays.